it is destined to be short-lived. I visited the Democratic Republic of Congo, DRC, and was deeply struck by both the resilience of its people and the immense untapped potential of the nation. This is a country rich in natural resources, a country that, if given the opportunity, could fuel the development of an entire region. Its vast mineral wealth, fertile land, and a strategic position should have made it a pillar of stability and prosperity in Africa. Yet, instead of prosperity, the DRC has been plagued by conflict and exploitation. It is heartbreaking to see how this great nation has become a victim of global greed, where multinational corporations, external powers, and vested interests drive on the instability. Instead of fostering development, they extract wealth from the land while leaving destruction in their wake. Today, the eastern region of the DRC remains engulfed in violence, a conflict not just rooted in internal issues, but fueled by external actors and regional rivalries. The suffering of its people is not an accident. It is a consequence of deliberate exploitation and neglect by the international community. While world leaders issue statements of condemnation, their words carry no action, no real commitment to ending the suffering of innocent people. The DRC, like so many of our nations, remains a stark example of how fragile states are left to stand for themselves while global powers prioritize their own interest over peace and stability. This is the bitter reality we must confront, and it is why Decision 7 Plus must continue to fight for a world where our countries are not longer pawns in the games of the powerful, but architects of their own future. I have closely followed the path of the other G7 Plus member countries, witnessing both progress and ongoing struggles. I am pleased to see Somalia making strides towards self-reliance, gradually breaking free from the cycle of international dependency. The resilience of its people and the determination of its leaderships to reclaim sovereignty over the development and security are commendable. At the same time, I remain deeply concerned about Yemen, a nation caught in the crossfire of hegemonic rivalries. What was once a land of great history and culture has become a battlefield for external interest, with its people bearing the brunt of war, hunger, and displacement. Yemen's suffering is a clear reminder of how conflict-affected countries too often become arenas for geopolitical contest rather than recipients of genuine support for peace and stability. How many more of our countries must suffer before the world listens? How many more? We must know, we must now ask ourselves, do we continue to wait for the world to change, or do we take charge of our own future? This is the real question. It is time to accept the painful truth. The global system led by powerful nations has failed us time and time again. But as leaders, we must also recognize our own responsibility and get our acts together. The fate of our countries does not lie in the hands of others. It lies in our own hands. We must remember to serve our people with patience, dedication, and humility. It is within this context that I firmly believe that G7 Plus has gathered enough lessons and experiences to take control of our own destiny. We can no longer afford to wait for external solutions that often fail to address our realities. Our greatest strength lies in the solidarity among our member states, a unity built on shared struggles, resilience, and the collective aspiration for peace and stability. Therefore, I would like to propose 3 key action points as our collective roadmap to transcend rhetoric and create a real lasting impact on the lives of our people. First, decades of conflict and war have left deep social, political, and societal divisions in our countries. These divides are not just a remnant of the past, they are the very cracks through which proxy wars seep in, turning our nations into battlegrounds for external interest. Unhealed wounds become the breeding ground for recurring conflicts, ensuring that the cycle of violence continues across generations. Unless we address these divisions and work towards genuine reconciliation, peace will remain fragile and instability will persist. It is an urgent necessity to avoid being felt behind. If the world truly desires peace, then it must invest in dialogue and reconciliation rather than conflict management and containment. Let us take the lead in making this happen. Second, despite being labeled as fragile, our countries hold immense wisdom and experience that can inspire meaningful reforms in state building. Our struggles have made us experts in overcoming adversity, and the lessons we have learned are invaluable. I am pleased that the G7 Plus has taken this initiative to bring together practitioners from the member states to design a framework for peer learning. This framework, which was discussed in Abu Dhabi and will be discussed as part of this meeting's agenda, has the potential to become our blueprint for shaping policies, strengthening institutions, and guiding our advocacy work on the global stage. Instead of relying solely on external models that do not reflect our realities, we can use our collective knowledge to propose solutions that work for us. Now, more than ever, we must rely on our own wisdom to guide us forward. Let us embrace this opportunity to turn our shared experience into a powerful force for change, shaping the future of peace-building, governance, and sustainable development in our nations. Third, the international community, whether traditional donors or emerging global powers, must see us as equal partners in shared prosperity and a bridge for a more peaceful world. They must move beyond viewing fragile states as perpetual aid recipients and instead invest in our resilience. A more stable G7 Plus means fewer crises, fewer wars, and ultimately reduced needs for international aid. Instead of reacting to conflicts after they erupt, they should invest in preventing wars before they begin. The United Nations and multilateral institutions must also recognize our wisdom and incorporate our lived experiences into their policies. Fragile states are not just passive players in the international system. We have knowledge that can contribute to global peace-building efforts. Fourth and last, I urge all G7 Plus member states to mobilize political capital and invest in strengthening our collective cause. The G7 Plus was built on the foundation of solidarity, a principle that is often overlooked or even dismissed by traditional international relations experts. Unlike the alliances formed out of political convenience or strategic competition, our unity is rooted in a shared struggle for peace, stability, and self-determination. We have the potential to safeguard peace in our countries, to resist external interference, and to prevent our nation from once again becoming the battlegrounds of hegemonic rivalries. The world is increasingly divided into competing blocks, but rather than being drawn into these power struggles, we have the opportunity to form something different, a bloc for peace. We have already demonstrated that solidarity can transcend geography, politics, and history, from Africa to the Pacific, from the Middle East to Asia and Caribbean. The G7 Plus has united countries from diverse backgrounds under a single vision, that fragility is not a fate, but a challenge that can be overcome. If we strengthen our unity, we can reshape the global conversation on peace building, where others from blocs for war we can stand as a bloc for peace, where global powers seek divisions, we can offer an example of cooperation beyond borders, where fragile states have historically been ignored or used for strategic gain, we can claim our rightful place as equal partners in shaping a just and peaceful world. Let us seize this moment, not just for ourselves, but for the generations to come. The G7 Plus can be a beacon of hope in a world increasingly defined by division. But to achieve this, we must commit, invest, and act together. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, this world is becoming increasingly fragmented, with global divisions deepening and conflicts among the powerful reshaping the geopolitical landscape. As history has shown us, when great powers clash, it is the most vulnerable who suffer the most. Once again, we see wars being fought, not just on battlefields, but through economic coercion, political interference, and proxy conflicts, many of which are playing out in our own countries. We are at a crossroads. We can either stand as passive observers, left at the mercy of global forces beyond our control, or we can rise together, united and determined, to safeguard our nations from the scars of war and poverty. The choice is ours. We have in our hands the G7 Plus, a platform built on solidarity, resilience, and the unwavering belief that peace is possible. I truly hope that these meetings and the discussions we hold over the next 2 days will result in a clear and decisive path forward, one that leads our nations toward lasting peace, stability, and self-reliance. I wish you all the very best in your endeavors. Let us make history together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, Prime Minister of Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste and eminent person of G7+, Mambot Kerala Xanana Guzmão.
Now, the evolving through 15 years, the G7+ journey from informal network to global actor. Presentation by Dr. Helder da Costa, General Secretary of G7+.
Excellency, President of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste and Special Envoy of the G7+, Dr. José Ramos Horta, Nobel Laureate. Excellency, President of the National Parliament of Timor-Leste, Dr. Fernanda Delay, and honorable members of the Parliament of Timor-Leste. Excellency, Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste and eminent person of G7+, Mambot Xanana Guzmão, Excellencies, members of the Government of Timor-Leste, Excellency, Deputy Prime Minister for Social Affairs, Engineer Mariano Assanami Serino, Excellency, Madam Chair of G7+, Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Sierra Leone, Excellency, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, Mr. Bendito Freitas, my co-host of this meeting, Excellencies, Ministers of G7+ member states and delegates, Excellency, Ms. Elizabeth Spear, Assistant Secretary General for Peace Building Support Office of the United Nations, thank you for being with us today. Excellencies, members of Diplomatic Corps, Head of UN agencies, development partners, civil society organizations, academia, private sector, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, all protocols observed. It is my honor and privilege to stand in this podium to present to you an overview of the G7+ achievements over the past 15 years and outline the key challenges ahead. We have heard from our four leaders in this table, outlining the progress that G7+ has achieved, including the way forward. I feel emotional standing here in front of you. 15 years ago, when I was serving the former Minister of Finance, Ms. Emilia Pires, in the margin of the G7+ meeting here in Dili, Timor-Leste, presided over by our dear Mambot Xanana Guzmão, in the margin of the first international dialogue on peace building and state building, where Timor-Leste was the host of this important event, it was in this very podium that the representative of the Democratic Republic of Congo, Mr. Armand Kasumbu, and under the leadership of Minister Olivier Kamitatu, the former Minister of Planning of DRC, he stood up here and read this landmark document of the Dili Declaration, which is a groundbreaking for the G7+ over the past 15 years. And that document, as Madam Minister Chair of G7+ referred to earlier on, still valid as a guiding document for the G7+. Ladies and gentlemen, next please. The G7+ emerged as a response to the marginalization of fragile conflict-affected states. These nations are often excluded from global policy making and relegated to being passive recipients of aid. Many labeling that we face, including branded as fragile or failed or conflict-affected states. We are also treated as security threats because of our countries facing instability, politically, economically, and socially. We are also a passive recipient of aid. And worse, we are caught in the middle of geopolitical and geo-economic struggles between the major powers. Hence, we need a voice. That's why within the fragile states, by 2030, 1.5 billion people live in conflict-affected states. And we need a voice in this momentum. That's why the G7 Plus came into force. Next, please. Now, allow me just to bring the audience back to 2010. Let's navigate back there. Here in this building, in the historic building, you remember that at that time, this market was abandoned market because of the crisis of the 2006, 7, and 8. And it was under the Prime Minister, Mamboet Shinana Gusmaung, that this building was rehabilitated within 53 days in preparation for the first international dialogue on peace building, state building. And right on day one, when the big event took place where President Horta also delivered the speech at that time, Mamboet Shinana Gusmaung inaugurated this venue to be the Dili Convention Center. So this is a bit of history of Dili Convention Center to my fellow distinguished delegates from the G7 Plus member states to know. So the G7 Plus was founded in 2010, based on solidarity and voluntarism, aimed at first amplify the voices of conflict-affected states. Never before in history that the group of 7 Plus stood side by side together with our development partners to discuss issues of development issues at the country level. I will mention this in a bit later. Second was to advocate for a new development paradigm that puts peace first, and it is nationally owned and led. That's why we call it country-owned and country-led system. We also promote peaceful means to end conflict. As you heard the Prime Minister's speech, which is very emotional, it's coming from the bottom of his heart, traveling to many countries in G7 Plus member states over the past decade to help promote peaceful means to end conflict in fellow G7 Plus member states. One of the aims of the G7 Plus we founded was to facilitate the sharing of inspiring lessons and also redefine fragility by highlighting resilience rather than fragility. Next, please. So who are the founding members of the G7 Plus? The small letter G symbolizes group, and 7 symbolizes the 7 countries that you can see on the screen, namely Afghanistan, Central African Republic, Cote d'Ivoire, Democratic Republic of Congo, Haiti, Sierra Leone, and Timor-Leste. Why these 7 countries chosen, by the way? It was in the margin of the 3rd high-level forum on aid effectives in Ghana, Accra. And I remember the former Secretary of State, the Minister of Juventude and Desporto, Mr. Nelio Iza, at that time he was a journalist and traveling with us to cover this event. And it was in the margin of a presentation by the 2 ministers, Madam Emilia Pires and Bob Woodward from Australia, that created a lot of interest for people to be able to volunteer themselves to monitor the OECD 10 Principles for Engagement in Fragile States. So looking around the room, those 7 countries came forward and volunteered themselves to monitor the OECD 10 Principles for Engagement in Fragile States, and subsequently those 7 countries became the founding members of the G7+. Next, please. From an advocacy group to a global force, here is our journey. Right in Dili, 2010, when the G7+ was founded, a year later, after the ministerial meeting in Juba, South Sudan, we launched the landmark document of the G7+ family in Busan, which is called the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, which is recognized by the international community and subscribed by 45+ countries and international organizations, including the UN, the IMF, and all the other international financial institutions. Then in 2013, we coined the Fragile to Fragile Cooperation, inspired by the Global South-South Cooperation. Then in Lomé, 2014, under the ministerial meeting in Togo, we formalized the group charter. And the charter is now registered officially at the UN Treaty Division, and it's recognized as a legal entity. And it is us, our homework for G7+ member states, to ratify the charter, because so far we have 6 countries who ratified the charter, and the remaining are yet to be done. As our leaders explained in their speech, in 2015, in the inception of the Agenda 2030, there were a lot of discussion on SDG. And thank God, the G7+ ambassadors in New York stood firmly and determined to defend and secure the SDG 16. That's why SDG 16 was included in the Agenda 16 of Agenda 2030. As you know, in 2015, the G7+ was able to join the WTO accession group. I'm pleased and proud to say that 3 years ago, 2 G7+ member states became officially as a member of the WTO group, namely Comoros and Timor-Leste, where President himself went to Dubai together with the President of National Parliament and the entire Ministry of Economic Development from Timor-Leste, and other members of Parliament went there to witness this historic moment. 17 years ago, ladies and gentlemen, 2 countries that also joined WTO from the G7+ member states, Afghanistan and Liberia. And I'd like to recognize the work that is done by our ambassadors in Geneva, our former ambassador Lourdes Bessa here, previous ambassadors also contribute to the successful negotiation of G7+ WTO accession group. And the most important milestone within our G7+ family is the attainment of the UN observer status, where every year within the United Nations General Assembly, the G7+ has got a prime spot based on alphabetical order among the other intergovernmental organizations, secure a place to observe the deliberations within the United Nations General Assembly. Alongside with WTO, OECD, European Union, ASEAN, Pacific Island Forum, you name it, even African Union. So we were sitting there as a part to be able to observe the United Nations deliberations. And from 2020 onwards up to now, we are expanding our influence on climate change, as Minister of Foreign Affairs mentioned earlier, including our call for debt relief, where President in his speech everywhere in big forum calling for abolition of debt relief faced by developing countries, in particular indebted countries, including for food security. I would like also to just highlight a few impacts in terms of redefining engagement. We've been engaging with multiple players of partners around the world. You name it, United Nations agencies, international development think tanks, academia, private sector, international financial institutions, so that the fragile states' voice are now recognized. The latest addition was our partnership with the OECD. They are now running every year producing fragility report, which is produced after consultation with member states. With the World Bank, we also work with them to work on the conflict fragility, FCV, fragility, conflict and violence events every February or March every year. Next, please. Here are the key wins transforming advocacy into action. As I mentioned, we secure special considerations in IDA, International Development Association. The previous World Bank managed to get some assistance from the development partners towards fragile states. And when you follow the Prime Minister's early intervention, he had some experience with the World Bank President, especially with the former President Kim, which is very interesting. The other gain that G7 Plus as a group faced was gain a voice at UNGA, Munich Security Conference, another platform that G7 Plus also is now gaining traction, WTO and other key global forums. And the next win was institutionalize our fragile to fragile cooperation. I'm proud and pleased to share with the audience today that this F2F is now officially recognized by the big G7 industrialized countries in the meeting in Biarritz in France in 2019 as a framework for cooperation within the G7 Plus members. And also it's an influenced global policy framework, as I mentioned earlier on, with WTO, OECD, the World Bank, and other international think tanks. And the latest addition was that in Baku last year, COP29, the G7 Plus was able to influence the global policymakers, the presidencies of COP, by advocating for tailoring climate change. That's why in the video you saw a letter from the President of Sierra Leone, and that letter was publicized by more than 100 media outlets around the world. Just a couple of examples of F2F cooperation, which we call a new model of solidarity. Timor-Leste is generous enough to support the election process in Guinea-Bissau in 2013, 2014, and 2015. And I see the Minister of Estatal, Sir Tomás Cabral, who led the team to do this in Guinea-Bissau a few years ago. And also, as Prime Minister mentioned in his speech, there was a mediation, peace mediation, helping Central African Republic to restore peace process in Bangui. That's why they came up with the Bangui Peace Forum within that particular country. Back years ago, when the Ebola crisis struck some Western African countries, Timor-Leste, again, with the limitations that it had, it did show its solidarity, human solidarity, by supporting Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea in tackling Ebola crisis. And also sharing lessons in public financial management, natural resource management, and governance is now becoming the core program of the F2F cooperation, including the peer learning in election management. And I'd like to inform you also that the G7 Plus is also now involved in the election observation mission in 5 countries over the past 2 years, namely Timor-Leste, Guinea-Bissau, Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Solomon Islands last April. And Minister of Foreign Affairs of Solomon Islands, I deeply thank your Prime Minister for acknowledging the role of the G7 Plus in the election observation mission, and your Prime Minister quoted the humble work of the G7 Plus in his inaugural speech in the National Parliament. Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, allow me just to outline some key challenges ahead, alongside with the big grandiose vision that our leaders mentioned in the speech of President Horta and Mamboet Shanana Guzman. As global power shifts and reduce aid, we are now looking inward. What can we do to help each other rather than counting? As you can see, the US cuts aid everywhere. Even the UN also is suffering the pressure on this. And declining multilateralism, everyone is questioning about this. Now, what can we do? Global crisis with disproportionate impact on fragile and conflict-affected states. Rising crises and proxy wars in member states, for example, in DRC, in Yemen, in Afghanistan, which is already an ongoing, and also now in Haiti and elsewhere. And the last one is financial constraints that hinder the G7 plus operations, with Timor-Leste sole bearing the cost. This is something that we will be discussing in a closed-door meeting of our ministerial meeting tomorrow. Ladies and gentlemen, the way forward. The focus of this ministerial meeting, one, is to strengthen the G7 plus as a group, that we need more consolidation. As our group is as dispersed from Asia, Pacific, Middle East, Africa, and the Caribbean, we need to consolidate better. And also to strengthen our F2F cooperation in those key areas that we are going to discuss in our ministerial meeting today and tomorrow. And we also would like to push for inclusive global governance. And the most important one is to ensure peace-first approach remains central to our development policies. Because our G7 Plus motto is that no development without peace, no peace without development. And the last one, enhancing our capacity for dialogue and reconciliation and engage with emerging donors. Finally, I'd like to take this opportunity to pay tribute to my secretariat team, as alluded by Mr. President and Prime Minister. The secretariat now has 3 offices, here in Dili, Timor-Leste, in Lisbon, Portugal, and last year in September we opened a new office representative in New York. This requires a lot of dedication, heavy responsibility, and humility to carry this shared vision of the G7 Plus in order to enhance visibility and impact at the global level. Thank you, my secretary team, for your enduring work, which can be a source of inspirational to serve our member states. With that note, I end my presentation here, and thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, the General Secretary of G7 Plus, Dr. Helder da Costa.
And now, a view from the United Nations Secretariat, G7 Plus, as a global actor. A speech by Her Excellency, Ms. Elizabeth Speer, Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support, Peacebuilding Support Office, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs.
His Excellency, José Ramos Horta, President of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste and Special Envoy of the G7+. His Excellency, Kai Rana Zanana Gusmão, Prime Minister of the Democratic Republic of Timor-Leste and eminent person of G7+. His Excellency, Bendito dos Santos Freitas, Minister of Foreign Affairs and Cooperation, Timor-Leste. Her Excellency, Kenya Barley, Minister of Planning and Economic Development of Sierra Leone and Chair of G7+. Dr. Helder da Costa, General Secretary of G7+. Excellencies, Ministers, Delegates, all protocols observed. First of all, my deep gratitude to our hosts, the government and people of Timor-Leste, for their warm welcome and hospitality. Muito obrigada. It's a privilege to address this ministerial meeting, the 6th ministerial meeting of the G7+, as you commemorate 15 years of progress under the banner of unity, shaping the future of peace and resilience in G7+ countries. I'm particularly honored to provide a further view from the UN Secretariat perspective on the G7+ as a global actor, following the excellent presentations of this morning and the most recent expose by Dr. Elder Costa, General Secretary of G7+, and of course building on the remarks of my leader, Secretary General Antonio Guterres. Allow me to begin by congratulating the G7+ on this occasion and commending the G7 Secretariat and member states for their steadfast commitment to advancing peace, resilience, and development. The United Nations recognizes the critical role that the G7 plays in amplifying the voices of fragile states, advocating for peace-first approaches, and fostering solidarity among nations facing common challenges. This year's milestone offers an opportunity to reflect on the transformative journey of the G7+, and for this body and its members to chart a course for the future. As we've just heard from Secretary General Guterres, as we work to tackle global challenges for a better tomorrow, the voices of the G7+ will be vital. The establishment of the G7+ in Dili in 2010 was a pivotal moment for global development discourse. Born out of solidarity and volunteerism, the G7+ emerged as a response to the marginalization of fragile and conflict-affected states. As we were just reminded by Dr. Elda Costa, these nations were often excluded from global policymaking and relegated to being passive recipients of aid. The vision that brought together the G7+ founding members 15 years ago, the call to give a voice to countries that were otherwise excluded, remains as relevant today as it was at that time, and possibly even more so. The current global challenges are multiple, interconnected, and profound, as we've heard from the various speakers thus far. Armed conflict surging to unprecedented levels, with 1 in 8 people regularly exposed to violent conflict last year. A proliferation of conventional and non-conventional weapons fueling the violence. A deepening climate crisis and widening inequalities within countries and among them. And more than 120 million forcibly displaced people, due primarily to conflict, but also due to climate change and environmental degradation. Progress on most sustainable development goals is either moving too slow or has regressed below the 2015 baseline. And as you know all too well, the countries affected by fragility and conflict are accounting for a growing share of global poverty, with some estimates predicting that 72% of the world's extreme poor will be in fragile states by 2030. In the UN Secretary General's policy brief, A New Agenda for Peace, which came out in July 2023, he already sounded the alarm on many of these issues. He particularly lamented the weakening solidarity among nation states, a cornerstone of G7+ advocacy and action. He warned of the growing trust deficit among nations and within countries themselves, including between citizens and their governments, making all of us less safe. He advocated for an embrace of the rule of law and adherence to international law, and promoted the indispensable principles of trust, solidarity, and universality. This speaks very much to the G7+. Since the issuance of A New Agenda for Peace in 2023, as we've heard from various speakers already, geopolitical divisions and competition, as well as increased transactional approaches to foreign assistance, have only deepened. We're at a moment where, paradoxically, while we need multilateralism more than ever, it is increasingly questioned, too often undermined, and now, in the face of significant aid cuts, under tremendous strain. But as we know, these global problems and threats cannot be successfully tackled by any single country alone. This is why this ministerial meeting is so timely, and why the role of the G7 Plus is so critical. Over the past decade and a half, the G7 Plus has evolved from an advocacy group into a formidable global actor. Its achievements are numerous, as clearly spelled out by the General Secretary. The G7 Plus milestones reflect not only the persistence and the resolve of its member states to find solutions, but also their collective ability to influence global decision-making and policy frameworks. The G7 Plus has demonstrated that fragile states are not merely passive actors, but they are indispensable contributors to international peace and development. G7 Plus has also fundamentally reshaped how the world interacts with fragile states. Through initiatives such as the New Deal for Engagement in Fragile States, it has shifted the narrative from fragility to resilience. It has underscored that peace and development are inseparable, a concept that guides our work on peace building to this day. The institutionalization of fragile to fragile cooperation is another hallmark achievement. This model has facilitated peer learning and mutual assistance among member states and has demonstrated how solidarity can drive transformative change that can benefit all. It also demonstrates that international relations can be successfully rooted in mutual support rather than a zero-sum approach. And it has also brought sustained focus and attention and assistance to a number of countries that might otherwise be forgotten or neglected, as several high-profile conflicts and contexts grab international headlines and the world's attention. I would note, as an example, the G7 Plus's considerable engagement in the Central African Republic, which I just visited several weeks ago. Despite these successes, as we've just heard, significant challenges persist for G7 and its members. These challenges underscore the need for renewed commitment from all stakeholders. The voice, advocacy, and active involvement of fragile states, which are disproportionately affected by worldwide crises, cannot be diminished in global efforts to address pressing issues such as peace, development, and climate. Excellencies, as we look ahead, it's imperative to build on the achievements of the past 15 years while addressing current and emerging challenges. Allow me to focus on 5 areas where we can work together as global actors, also building on those just identified by General Secretary Eldred da Costa. First, focusing on the implementation of key political commitments. As Dr. da Costa and the UN Secretary General underscored, G7 Plus was instrumental in achieving SDG 16 in 2015. G7 member states also contributed significantly to last year's Pact for the Future, which has become the blueprint for advancing our global goals and for building a more effective and networked multilateralism. The continued advocacy and active involvement of G7 Plus countries within the UN framework and beyond it will be critical to move these issues forward to greater implementation. In this same spirit, I would also encourage G7 Plus countries to engage actively in this year's United Nations Peacebuilding Architecture Review, co-facilitated in New York headquarters by Egypt and Slovenia. This review is a key opportunity to strengthen our peacebuilding tools, including the Intergovernmental Peacebuilding Commission, and make them more fit for purpose to tackle contemporary and future challenges. Second, prioritizing national ownership and prevention. The Pact for the Future encourages member states to develop national prevention and peacebuilding strategies. Nationally owned and led prevention strategies can provide a framework for governments to identify and mitigate risks before they escalate into violence. They can be roadmaps for countries to strengthen institutions, address root causes of conflict, promote dialogue and reconciliation, and foster sustainable peace. National prevention and peacebuilding strategies can be ideal vehicles to foster greater inclusion and inclusive institutions, as called for in SDG 16. In that respect, this year is also a year to leverage the 10th anniversary of the Youth Peace and Security Agenda and the Women Peace and Security Agenda, which is marking its 25th anniversary, both agendas established by member states. This is critical, as the meaningful participation of both women and youth is indispensable for fostering peace and furthering development. The General Secretary spoke a few minutes ago of 1.5 billion people who need a voice. Indeed, the majority of those people are young people, and at least half of them are women. They certainly need to be at the decision table, and they certainly need a voice. G7 Plus could encourage the membership to consider the crafting and implementation of inclusive prevention and peacebuilding strategies and to present them at the UN Peacebuilding Commission, which offers a platform for peacebuilding accompaniment, sharing of best practices, and resource mobilization. Third, tackling the issue of development and peace financing. Global military spending has reached an all-time high of $2.4 trillion US annually, dwarfing the resources available for development and representing more than 1,200 times the $2 billion allocated to peacebuilding worldwide, according to the OECD. As the Secretary General pointed out, this year's Financing for Development Conference is an opportunity for fragile states to push for action on addressing serious financial gaps and debt issues. Beyond this advocacy, it's important to keep reminding the international community that investing in prevention and addressing the root causes of conflict are cost-effective and wise investments. As global actors in peacebuilding, we can work together to demonstrate results and impact, including through collaboration via the UN's recently established Peacebuilding Impact Hub. Fourth, strengthening fragile-to-fragile and South-South and triangular cooperation. There are clear synergies between the G7 Plus and its fragile-to-fragile cooperation and the work of the UN on South-South and triangular cooperation. Within the UN, the Peacebuilding Commission is uniquely positioned to serve as a platform for South-South and triangular cooperation in peacebuilding, and further collaboration between the G7 Plus and the PBC leadership, with Germany currently as chair, could help to advance such cooperation as a tool for peacebuilding and resilience in fragile and conflict-affected countries. By leveraging the PBC's broad convening power and advisory role, on the one hand, and the G7 Plus's expertise in fragile-to-fragile cooperation and its emphasis on solidarity among conflict-affected states, this partnership could further facilitate peer learning, mobilize resources, and help to reshape global peacebuilding priorities. Fifth, enhancing partnerships for peacebuilding. In order to advance our mutual goals, diverse and complementary partnerships are indispensable. Governments, civil society organizations, international and regional organizations, and community leaders all have roles to play in fostering reconciliation, addressing the root causes of conflict, and building inclusive, prosperous, and peaceful societies. As does the G7 Plus, my office, the Peacebuilding Support Office, closely engages with international financial institutions, which a new agenda for peace describes as agents for peace. We are striving to foster greater complementarity and synergies between UN support in fragile and conflict-affected contexts and that of the banks, based on nationally owned strategies. This is an area of endeavor that could benefit from greater dialogue and exchange between us. Mindful of the current financial constraints and limitations of foreign aid, we are also initiating efforts to spur peace-positive investment by private sector actors in fragile and conflict-affected countries, another area of potential dialogue and exploration. We also work to bring civil society voices to the UN to incorporate their views on global peacebuilding policies and objectives, primarily through the UN CSO Peacebuilders Dialogue, which we initiated in 2023. We would welcome participation participants from your own vibrant civil societies in future such events, including the next dialogue scheduled for late 2025. Excellencies, I think we all agree that there is no substitute for solidarity, international cooperation, and multilateralism, and that peace must definitely come first if we are to advance towards a prosperous and sustainable future. These common understandings between G7 Plus and the United Nations are critical touchstones for deepening our collaboration. I salute the efforts of G7 Plus, which have and the countries that are members, which have shown that fragile states are not defined by their vulnerabilities, but rather by their resilience and potential for transformation. The progress that you have achieved as a united global actor over the past 15 years is a testament to what can be achieved when nations come together with generosity and a common purpose. The United Nations remains a steadfast partner with the G7+. Let us continue working and walking together towards a world where peace and development are not just aspirations, but a reality for all. Thank you. Merci. Muito obrigado.
Thank you very much, Madam Elizabeth Spear, Assistant Secretary General for Peacebuilding Support, Peacebuilding Support Office, Department of Political and Peacebuilding Affairs.
Telespectadores no ouvintes Rádio Televisão Timor-Leste, fonita acompanha iha sessão ohinian, liliu iha parte to agora ita harekata iha discurso lubu kida nebe maka apresenta ona husi entidades relevantes sira liliu konaba objetivo husi encontro ministerial zige setimas ninen nomos existência tinan sanulur sen lima zige setimais hari liu husi fatini denu